Hello and welcome everybody to another edition of Rowing Chat. We're here today with a guest from Canada. Hello, who are you and what do you do?
Hi, Rebecca. My name is Scott Frandsen. I've been on the Canadian rowing team for the last 3 Olympics, and I now currently coach with Mike Tatey at the University of California, which is also my alma mater. I started rowing in Canada, rowed 2 years in high school at Brentwood College on the West Coast, continued on to the University of California and rowed there for 4 years and had a good group. We won 3 national championships in a row. I continued on to Oxford, where I got my master's while competing in the boat race against Cambridge. And for those of you that know about the boat race, after 4.25 miles, my Oxford crew won by 1 foot. So that was a good one to be a part of. On the Canadian team, started off with under 23s in 2001 and 2002, and senior team from 2002 for most of the time up through 2012. So in the 8 for Athens, and then the pair for Beijing and London.
Fantastic. That's a very complete rowing biography. It's one of the things that entertains me. I'm sure it's not completely true, but we were always told in the UK that if you wanted to go and row at a club in North America, you had to present a rowing CV or biography. And we always wondered what it was we could say about our wins that would attract anyone to want us to become members of their rowing club. So,
is that you're asking me what you should put on your CV?
No, I'm just joking. When I get to put in my application to join a rowing club in North America, I'll come and ask you. Is it true? Do you have to do that?
No, I mean getting into the recruiting process here at Cal. I mean, we look at quote unquote rowing CV, but for a regular rowing club here, no, I wouldn't think that you'd have to submit a rowing CV.
Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that later.
Yeah, okay.
We've had some lovely questions submitted in advance by listeners, and the first one comes from Philip. He is asking, what's the most effective way to gain knowledge in order to improve your experience as a coach?
I mean, I think it's just putting yourself out there and getting the experience whatever way you can. One way to do it, I think, is as an athlete. I don't think it's a necessity, but I think, especially for me, that's been one way to gain more rowing knowledge. But if you weren't able to or didn't weren't in the sport as you were young, or weren't able to get to a level where you had much experience, I don't think it's a necessity to have been a high-level rower to be a good coach. I know a lot of guys or a lot of coaches that weren't rowers, but I think the more successful ones have just put themselves out there. Asked more experienced coaches questions and asked to have mentors or asked to ride along in launches and just taking it in. There's a lot of people that come out and ride in the launch with Mike Tatey here at Cal just to learn from his experience. So ask questions. Don't afraid to look like the inexperienced coach, because all coaches start from scratch at some point. And for me, having been an athlete, I just draw on all the coaches that I had along the way. I've had some well-known coaches and some ones that weren't so well known, but all along the way from high school with Tony Carr all the way through to the last couple of years with Terry Paul and now with Mike Tatey. I take little bits, both positive and negative, from all my coaches along the way, and really try to piece those together to come up with my own style. As Tatey always says, there's many roads to Rome. It's a cliche, but there's a lot of different training programs that work, and you just have to find your own style and test it out, and be able to also have the perspective to take a look at it and see the positives and negatives with what you've come up with, and have the ability to remove yourself from the process a little bit and know or see that you've made some mistakes, or make the changes that are needed. So I think really just having an open mind and the desire to learn from all those around you, and actively seeking out those opinions and that help.
That's a very full answer. I am interested by what you do in practice. Say you're sitting next to another coach in a launch, and they're running the practice. What are you watching and listening for?
I think, I mean, it can go down to just the drills that they run in a practice, or how they interact with the athletes, what their points of emphasis are, how they get those points of emphasis across. You know, different coaches have different styles. Some yell and scream, and some say very little, but those words have more impact. So again, I think it's seeing how they. I think a large part of it is seeing how they get what they want to focus on across the athletes, and every coach will be different. But yeah, looking at, you know, all the way from the drills that they run to the points of the stroke, or the rhythms that they want to emphasize. Every coach that I've had along the way has been slightly different or completely different. You know, in my early days of rowing, I had to jump from high school style of rowing with a different technique, a different rhythm, to the Cal style of rowing, back to the Canadian style of rowing, back to the Cal style of rowing, back to the Canadian style of rowing, back to Oxford. Like every summer or every fall season, I had to completely change my style of rowing. And I think that's shown me along the way that, you know, I think, you know, for a large part, all of those crews found a way to go fast, and in very different ways. So as long as the whole group or the team has buy-in to what the coach is preaching, there's many different ways to win, and I think a coach or a young coach can forge his own style and pick and choose little points from all the other coaches out there.
That's great. For myself, I always advocate, if you're going to try something that you've watched another coach use.
Yeah, and you
try and use the exact same words that they use. And
yeah, I mean, I think you can try to directly emulate a coach, but then it feels a little bit false if you're just trying to copy and paste. You know, I think you have to take in, again, the points of emphasis or the style and make it your own. Otherwise, it's not going to come across as genuine.
I understand that. You talked about the different rowing styles. Can you describe the Cal style versus the Canadian style? What would the outside person see as being different? And for you in the boat, what did you do differently?
And the Cal style has definitely changed over the years. When I was here at Cal with Craig Amerkanian as my freshman coach and Steve Gladstone as the varsity coach, we had a slight pause around the finish, and then not a rushing forward, but we took time around the finish, and then we're very efficient, but moving quickly through the catch. And then I'd fly back into the Canadian program after the intercollegiate season was done, and have to adjust completely to the old Mike Sprocklen style of rowing of quick around the finish, like throwing your hands away from the finish and taking all the time in the world over the toes. So they were absolute polar opposites. But like I said, as long as everybody in the boat is doing the same thing, and has the same point of focus or the same belief in that system, they can both be effective. And then going to the Oxford style with Sean Bowden of everything moving in one continuous flowing movement where there's no pause or there's no point of emphasis. Everything is moving with the speed of the boat. And so, I think they all work. It's just which one every coach is going to have a belief in which is better, or the group. As much as we try to teach or preach a certain emphasis or pause, not pause, but point of collection in the stroke. the group or the crew is going to have that morph into the one that they come up with. So it's just being able to work with that, and yeah, I think I keep coming back to it, but I realize that there's a lot of different ways to win.
For yourself, obviously now you're coaching at Cal, I guess you're coaching the style that Tatey commands, but if you were running the program yourself and you had a free choice, what would be your style that you would coach?
You're right. I am, I'm an assistant coach here with Mike Tatey, and I like what he's doing with the style of rowing. It is a very continuous movement, very similar to the Oxford style under Sean Bowden. If anything, there's a slight emphasis on collecting around the finish, but not so much that you're pausing or having to rush forward. It's a fairly continuous movement, again, with just a slight collecting of the stroke around the finish or coming away from the finish, and I completely agree with that. I think it doesn't make you rush at any point in the stroke, but there is that slight getting everyone together, and then you move up the slide to take the catch. And I'm not just towing the party line. I agree completely with what Mike Tatey is doing.
That's great. That's lovely. We've had a question from one of the listeners who's asked, when do you advise long strokes and shorter strokes? And then he clarifies that to say some coaches intentionally shorten the stroke to speed the rate, which doesn't necessarily translate to more speed.
Yeah, I would almost always advise long strokes. Something I've learned over the years is rowing is a combination of length, power, the rate of striking, and I'd also add to that how much you slow the boat down on the recovery. So if you're going to cut off the length of the stroke, odds are you're not going to see that translate to boat speed over the course of a 2-kilometer race or a 7-kilometer race like the boat race. I think a point that a lot of people overlook is I see it more as effective length rather than actual length. A lot of people row long strokes but aren't connected for the entirety of that stroke. So,
you're a man after my own heart.
and again, not plugging the Row Perfect, but I think training on the Row Perfect will really teach you a lot about effective length. And so when you watch races that Dave Calder and I raced in 2007, 2008, and even through 2011, 2012, we do row a shorter stroke than say Drew Ginn and Duncan Free. I'm not going to be able to necessarily match the length of 6'8" Duncan Free, but I think we rode a very effective length. There wasn't much slip at either end of the rowing stroke with our blades. Mm-hmm. So yes, you want to reach long and roll very long in the slides to push your actual length, but I think a lot of the reason that as a 6'2" rower I've been able to compete with the bigger guys is I think I'm quite effective with both ends of the stroke and therefore have a competitive effective length. In terms of teaching or emphasizing shorter versus longer strokes, again, always longer strokes other than maybe the first 10 strokes of the race where you're trying to get the boat up to speed. But even by stroke 12, 13, 14, you want to be pushing out to full length. And towards the end of the race, in the full-out sprint, okay, you're going to shorten up. You want to try to keep that length. But as you get up to 40, 42, 44, I think naturally you're going to shorten. But again, I wouldn't shorten down to quarter slide to try to get the rate up because you're actually not going to improve boat speed there.
There's an observation here from another listener, Chris, who says, an observation on styles. At 1,900 metres in the final of the lightweight men's 4-minors, about 5 crews were level and they all rowed differently style-wise. I think he means in the last Olympic Games.
Yep.
Now, Moving on to a next question submitted by Liz. Mediation and visualization are big in many sports. Have you used either of these to help you focus and develop as a rower, and how? And if not, what techniques do you use to prepare for a race?
I do. I think more visualization than meditation for me. But I do know, I did use, I guess, forms of meditation. When you're a national team athlete, especially in some of the training programs that I've been in, all you do is row, and it can become very intense and very stressful and all encompassing. And if you don't have that outlet to shut off from the day of training and focus on something else, then you can really wind yourself up and become unhealthily involved in the whole year of training. So I think you need to get through the year of training, you need to have some sort of technique or strategy to be able to shut off from the day of training and shut down and I guess mellow out a little bit. So in the stressful times, I definitely would come home and try to really turn off from rowing. There were times when I'd actually just sit down on the couch and not have the TV on, not have music on, and just take 5 minutes to calm down, and not calm down like I was always wound up, but just to get a little mental sort of peace with it all and move on to the next day, or taking care of the details like eating and recovering and doing all that for the next day. With visualization, I think that's a huge part of preparation for big races. If you don't do that day in and day out, and visualize what it's going to be like sitting on the start line, or go through race rehearsal after race rehearsal, then you're not really preparing for any scenario or every scenario come race day. And you can train fitness, you can train endurance, you can train technique, but if you're also not training the mind, then I think you're really leaving out a huge component of racing. Otherwise, what are you going to do when you're sitting the length down with 500 meters to go? So I remember a big, turning point for me was when I was at Oxford, and I'm sure I did elements of it before, but when I was at Oxford, in the month or two leading up to the boat race, we would sit, comfortably on couches in a room and actually have the coxswain talk us through every possible scenario. We do 1 or 2 races a week and talk through, okay, we're a length down going around this bend, or we're a length up. What are you going to do? How are you going to feel? And I remember talking through every race on the Canadian team too. So I think it's a big part, and I think it's a part that isn't usually emphasized nearly enough. In terms of, I guess, one race story of meditation, or getting myself to the point where I thought I needed to be with that mental zen or mental calmness before a race, because obviously sitting at the start line of an Olympic final is a very stressful, but I've also found very calming moment. I remember being very, very stressed for the Athens final, and I wanted to have, I guess, a strategy to deal with that going into Beijing. We had gone into the Beijing year as complete unknowns. Everybody was focusing on the U.S., sorry, not the U.S., the Australian and the Kiwi pair. No one had touched them in 3 years. And we had kind of burst onto the scene in Lucerne. And so all of a sudden we were contenders going into Beijing, and we felt the pressure. We felt the pressure of that. So going into the final, okay, back it up a little bit. We had a terrible race in the heat, and sort of redeemed ourselves in the semifinal. And so going into the final, we knew that we were contenders, and no matter how we looked at it, that the weight of that definitely sat heavily on our shoulders. So I actually. And if you watched any video of the race, you can see me sitting at the start line 3 minutes before the start, and I actually physically, or like visually in my head, lift the weight of the expectations, lift the weight of all my friends and family and supporters and the rest of the world. I lift it off my shoulders and throw it into the water. so that I could race with this freedom and sort of joy or enjoyment of being in the situation of being in the Olympic final with a very good chance of a medal and a good chance at winning. So that was my tactic of I guess using visualization or a form of, I guess, of meditation to get myself into the right frame of mind or mindset to get the best out of myself. So
did you have a crew psychologist who worked with the Canadian team?
Not in the early years, no. That was something that wasn't that wasn't used and was frowned upon. But I don't think we did even in the Beijing year. But in the London quad, we definitely did. We worked with a woman named Kirsten Barnes, who was an Olympian for the Canadian women's team, and I want to say 88 and 92, won a bunch of medals. So she'd been there. She'd sat at the start line of an Olympic final, and she knew what that was like.
She's married to Terry, the English guy, isn't she?
Yeah. So we worked a lot with Kirsten, and I really came to like her a lot. So she definitely helped.
It's interesting that, if you look at the number of years that you have been on the international scene, I think I can reasonably guess that your career has spanned the very rapid changes in, if I call them, support services that now surround a professional rowing team, whether it's specialist strength and conditioning coaching. You've mentioned sports psychology. I suspect that anthropometric measurements and testing were all done by external suppliers. Can you tell us a bit more about what it was like when you first started compared with when you retired?
That's a very nice way of calling me old. Thank you. No, you're right. When I first started on the team, the support services were fairly minimal, and I don't even think we had them taken care of by outside providers. They just weren't provided. In terms of weight coaches, I think we worked with one, maybe twice in the Athens Olympic year, and everything else was just sort of the old standard 4 or 5 exercises, one size fits all approach. And there was nothing in terms of nutritionists or advice with recovery or doing anthros or doing even lactate step tests or doing any sort of scientific approach to the sport, because that was all peripheral and an excuse not to train hard. Basically, was the approach. And while I don't see, I want to say there was some value in that just work hard approach, because I see a lot of these other things. I think a lot of these things like sports science and nutrition and recovery obviously have value. And if you get too deep into them, then they become distractions, I think. So I think there's a happy medium between obviously recognizing the value in sports science and doing these tests. But I think at the core, there still needs to be just that hardcore sort of work ethic. But in terms of the progression from when I was first on the team in 2001, 2002 to 2012, I mean, it's just huge. We now, in the 2012 year, we had a recovery station set up so athletes could get nutrition and shakes and everything into their systems immediately after workouts. Basically, taking care of the details for the athletes, and it's great. For me, I've always been the smaller athlete that's had to take care of the details myself to be able to be competitive. So that kind of stuff with eating well, recovering well, actually taking an active role in my recovery and doing ice baths, doing stretching and yoga so that I didn't get injured. That's stuff that I always did because I had to. But now that's being taken care of for everybody. So I think it's bringing everybody up to a level that's higher. And obviously that's why there's money being invested in those things.
It's interesting. I've had the opportunity to observe coaches working with development athletes coming up through to sort of under 21, under 23 style levels. And one of the things that it's very easy to forget is that young athletes are incredibly ignorant and don't know what they don't know. And the knowledge of all of the different tools that you've just run through has obviously been acquired by you through A, years, but B, an inquiring mind, a recognition that you feel you need to compensate for your perceived shortcomings and what can you do to maximize the effectiveness of your training. And I think that that is a challenge that faces many coaches of to how to get the message across appropriately to ambitious young men and women who think that they've got into the development squad and now they're there. And actually what they don't realise is that they're on step one of a very long ladder.
Yeah. No, exactly. And that's been a big transition for me, even in my short coaching career. You know, I think last year, I guess back it up even more. In the 2011, 2012 years, I had taken on a bit of a veteran role where I had to lead and show some of the younger guys or force them or educate them on how to take care of the details. And in my first year of coaching last year, I think I took on the role of peer a little bit too much and just expected that these young athletes would approach their sport or their training like I did, and expect that level of attention to detail and focus on technique and focus on all these different things that were so important to me and burned into me, and I guess, and I'm sure they weren't always obvious, but I want to say so obvious to me for ways to become competitive that I think I assumed that level of attention to detail would just be there, and then when it wasn't, I was almost confused. And so in my second year now as coaching, I've come, I think, more to be a coach and teach the lessons that obviously I learned at some point and had become so obvious to me. It's those lessons aren't necessarily obvious to everybody. So I definitely had to rethink my approach and to treat. I don't want to say my level of expectation needed to come back to. I needed to. I guess I need to treat these guys, or what am I trying to say? I needed to coach these guys on how to take care of the details rather than expect them to be there. And that's been a big transition for me. And to come back to your point, a lot of the new guys on the team, Canadian team, and even here at Cal, the level of expectation of all these services are here and they've always been there and we can take them for granted. At Cal we have so many resources available to the athletes now that we didn't have when I was here. With weight coaches, with the high performance center, with this weight room that's better than anything I've ever seen in the world, with academic support, with trainers and physiotherapists, with the level of resource that's available to the athletes these days is unbelievable. And I think you're right. No one can look back and realize, when I first broke onto the Canadian team, the top level funding was $1,100 a month, and we were expected to pay rent, food, car, everything on that, and somehow we did. And you get by with that, and now the level of funding is a little bit higher. But yeah, it's funny to look back to the original or the first days and think what we won with. And so that's why I say all these other services they're valuable, and there's obviously, the investment in them is valuable. But at the core of it has to be a lot of hard work.
So that moves us nicely onto the question that Sean has sent in. He says, is 14 too young to be dreaming of Olympic gold?
I I don't think so, but I'd also caution to not just solely set that one goal of Olympic gold. I think you need to set more incremental goals, not simply achievable goals, but set lofty goals, but be able to reach those or be able to work towards those along the way and see progress, and not just say, okay, I'm 14 years old, I want to win an Olympic gold medal, and that's it. Say you're 14 and you want to make your high school varsity 8, or you want to break a certain split on the erg, and set more sort of short-term goals so that you can be, I guess, encouraged and motivated by achieving or coming close to achieving those goals. And that's something that really, I think, drove my motivation. I don't remember having this big sort of epiphany type moment where I was young and I wanted to win an Olympic gold medal. It was always just a step-by-step process for me. I took up rowing in my last 2 years of high school and loved it and just sort of clicked with it. And I got to be relatively, I guess, proficient at rowing fairly quickly. And so I wanted to do it at the next level. And for me, that next level was rowing at Cal in the US. And that went well, and I wanted to do that at the next level, or at a similar level, but over in England. So I went to Oxford and had a great time there. And in the process, I wanted to break on the Canadian team. So I did under 23s, and it was always just sort of a step-by-step process, rather than, I know my previous pair partner, Dave Calder, had this, epiphany type moment when he was 11 or 12 years old, and he wanted to be an Olympic gold medalist. And so everyone has a different approach to it, but I guess I'll just circle back around and say again, there needs to be incremental goals that get you there, rather than just that one singular goal.
It's very interesting that although from the outside, someone like myself can look at the summary of your athletic career and it's very impressive, what we often fail to recognise, and what biographies and online profiles and interviews fail to probe, is the fact that you have indeed gone through winning the schoolboy under 16 championships, then the under 17 and the under 18. And there are very clear, as you say, intermediate goals which have been achieved. And even the most talented athletes broadly go through those steps. We were reading and talking in the UK this week about, they have a new race format and date for the National Rowing Championships. It's just happened. Yeah. And Pete Reed has been very vocal on his blog. In it, he says, I have never been a national champion before. And I find that astonishing, but it's a recognition that his particular career path into elite sport was a little different from many others, but also that a lot of these talent identification programs, which are very successful at drawing on young, potentially good athletes and pulling them out of the regular school, university, club system, means that these people actually have never had simple building experiences with crews, with groups of people, with rowing people who are less good than themselves, which older athletes like myself would have considered to be completely normal. And so they're getting quite an alien view of the sport.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I know Pete well from our Oxford connection. And yes. I mean, he has... the British team has always had their trials, which is a form of national championship. So he has won a bunch of quote unquote national championships. But I agree with you. There needs to be that, or this is a totally different experience for him to have this full national championship. And I think it's a great change. And I totally agree with you with these new talent ID programs. They find these young athletes with a lot of potential. And they don't necessarily go through those steps of gaining race experience and maturing, I guess. Yeah. They're thrown in, or they're blown up to this idea of themselves as going straight from nothing to, okay, now you're trying to make the national team. Yeah. And I see the motivation behind these programs, and there are a lot of success stories with them, but I also see them completely overwhelming or burning out a lot of athletes that, had they gone through those other steps, like high school national championships or college rowing, or they may have matured at a slower pace, but maybe they would have still gotten to a high level.
Do you often think that they don't learn to fall in love with the sport because of these heightened expectations?
Completely, and I think Canada right now is trying to emulate the British system, and we actually have Peter Shakespeare, who was responsible, I believe, for the British system,
and the Australian one before. He's done too.
Right, and so he's had a lot of success, and I think his program can have a lot of success. I've also seen, there's a lot of, now we have development centers all across Canada, and we have development coaches that are tasked with finding raw talent that hasn't necessarily been in rowing before, and getting them to that next level. And a lot of these centers they're able to find one or two, maybe three athletes, and those athletes basically train in isolation with that lofty goal of making it onto the national team. And they don't really have that team atmosphere. They don't have those intermediate races to get them to those next level. It's just 0 to national team. And I see a lot of them burning out. So, or just losing interest because they don't have that team draw to the sport. And I think that's a part of it, getting into a team environment where you're around a lot of like-minded, motivated, athletic guys, where you're going through this experience and this hard training experience with that goal at the end of it together. I think that's a big part of it. And so I think that needs to be somehow tweaked to make up for that lack of, I guess, team environment. I don't know how to do it, but I see a lot of, and just over the last couple of years, we've had a couple really promising young athletes that don't necessarily go anywhere because they weren't brought along through the process. I remember being back in high school and the national championships being the Olympics. Like that was the biggest race in my life. And the same thing my freshman year at Cal, and then the same thing my first varsity year at Cal. You're continually stretching your view of the biggest race of your life, and going through the nerves, going through the process of getting yourself ready to perform. And if you go straight from 0 to the Olympics, or straight from 0 to something like that, you haven't had that almost education in how to deal with it. And I think that's a big part of being able to perform on the international stage.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember when I learned to row at university, my number one goal was to row with Cambridge Blue Blades. And then in my second year of rowing, I achieved that goal. And suddenly I thought, I'm here, I'm at the top.
Right.
Very interesting perspective.
Yeah.
We're just going to take a short pause and hear from our sponsor.
Okay. Sorry, I was just going to say, was it
RP3 machine is the latest model rowing simulator. It was recently presented at the head of the Charles Regatta in Boston, Massachusetts, and is gaining international athlete users from countries such as the USA, Canada, Spain, New Zealand, Brazil, and the Netherlands. There is a video on YouTube which has been uploaded showing the Dutch men's four who won gold in Korea at the World Championships 2013, training on the Row Perfect simulator. And the thing to search for is Dutch 4- World Rowing Champion Korea 2013 on Row Perfect 3. I've put the link into the text chat. Moving on, back to you, Scott. Megan has asked a question. Do you think you have to have been a successful rower in order to become or gain respect as a successful coach?
I don't think it's I don't think it's a prerequisite. I think it can help, at least in those initial stages. I know that I've gained a certain level of respect with my athletes just because of the success I've had as a rower. But that doesn't necessarily make me a good coach. I think it might give you a longer leash in the first couple of years, but you still have to learn how to coach and not just be a rower. I mean, a lot of good rowers turn out to be poor coaches. So no, I think it does make those first couple of years easier. I think those that haven't reached a certain level of success in rowing just have to go through what we talked about in that first question of gaining the experience or the know-how or the different perspectives from different coaches that I've had, say, as a rower. They have to go through the process of doing that as a novice coach, and I think that just comes down to them being resourceful enough to get out there and ask for mentorship and ask questions and get that experience, or to start at a lower level and say coach less experienced rowers, maybe in high school or freshman high school, and work their way up. Whereas, say with having been an Olympian, I was able to enter the coaching hierarchy, if you want to call it that, at a little bit higher of a level based on my rowing experience. So I guess the time that I put into rowing shortened the time that I had to put into coaching to get to this level. But from here, I don't think my rowing experience will necessarily make me a good coach. I'm obviously still in a learning process on how to be an effective coach. And it's been interesting and a challenge for me. I was talking to a good friend of mine who used to be a freshman coach at Stanford, and his advice, because I'm coaching now, but I'm also, I still train. I'm training for Ironman. I'm training for a bunch of different things. But this friend of mine said something along the lines of, you need to figure out ways to make your athletes badasses, as he put it, but not, that doesn't necessarily happen just because you are. So training hard and showing my guys that I'm still training hard doesn't actually translate to being a good coach. So it's been an interesting switch for me to try to figure out ways to get the best out of everybody in their own, and take different approaches with the different athletes, because guys respond to different stimulus or stimuli.
So, give us an example.
Some guys need to be prodded, and some guys need to be rewarded. As the very, the basic, I guess, different motivations. Some guys.
How do you spot the guy who needs each of those? How do you tell the differences between them?
Maybe you don't at first, but then you see how they respond to the different forms of motivation. And if you have to respect these different forms of motivation without necessarily just being soft on the guys that don't like being yelled at. There are a lot of guys that don't take it well, but that's still what they need to hear. And it's an interesting process of learning how to push and how to push effectively, and not necessarily come over the top and tread on abusing them unnecessarily. But you try out different forms of motivation, and you realize that some respond better to actually speaking or to actually talking through what they need to do and how they need to improve, like respected adults, and some will give you lip service with that and then never actually make a change. So maybe a different form or a more aggressive approach needs to be taken with those guys.
It's interesting that the coaching style, I am told, of many US university programs is very much the coach tells the athletes what to do, whereas you've just illustrated something that actually is quite different, which is a respectful dialogue between two adults, one of whom is more experienced, but the other one's got to be the one who does the work. Do you favour or recognise either of those?
Uh, no, I mean, I think there's a need for both of them, and that's actually been something that's surprised me a lot with Mike Tatey. You know, you hear a lot of stories about him being this guy who yells and screams a lot, and you know, he has his moments, and those moments are always well deserved. But he's also a guy that asks the opinion of his athletes, and those ones that maybe are, say, more mature athletes or respond to that equality or speaking to them on the same level approach. You know, he has long conversations with a few guys on the team to get their perspective on how they think it's going and involve them in the process. And I think you're right. I think that the idea, the perspective, or the general belief of U.S. university coaching is, very, very much like a dictatorship where, yelling and screaming and you don't know anything and that sort of approach. And I assume some are like that. We're not like that at Cal. It doesn't mean that we're soft on our athletes or anything like that. I just think there's room for all different approaches, and I think it's on the coach to recognize that and to use all these different approaches to get the best out of each athlete and the team as a whole.
There's a nice anecdote from an interview with Tim McLaren when he was coaching at the US national team, and he's interviewing Jamie Coven, who's one of his athletes, and he said, so I've done a whole string of one-to-ones with athletes, and Jamie comes into the room and he says, hello coach, how can I help you? And he said every single one of the other interviews was, how can you, coach, help me? What a contrast.
Right. Yeah, that's. Jamie's been around for a long time, so maybe he's had that perspective. I don't know, burned into him or learned.
Moving on then to a question from Chris, who asks, "Who's the best coach you had and why?"
I've had a lot of coaches along the way, and for me, the coach that, and back up, I guess all the coaches have had their positives and had their negatives, or not negative necessarily, but maybe shortcomings. And I think the best, compilation of all the different things that I see as very valuable in a coach, the one that puts all those together in the best combination possible, I think, is Terry Paul. He values at the very core of it a lot of volume and a lot of hard work, but he also can take a step back from all of that and have time for all the new sports science stuff that's coming out and do all the different testing, be open to other things that can make his program better. He still has a lot of time for technical focus, which I think is very important. But he's also, and this isn't a necessity for a good coach, but I really like Terry. I think he and I see eye to eye on a lot of things. But even with that very good relationship that Terry and I have had over the years, he definitely saw through a lot of, or he was able to put that aside when I needed to be pushed in the last couple of years. So. Best combination of all the different coaches I've had, or the best coach I've had over the years, I think is Terry Paul.
You have referenced a couple of times that you're, quote, only 6'2". Obviously, you don't stand out physically as being taller and looking perhaps stronger than other athletes. How have you personally dealt with those maybe doubters who didn't see you as a natural talent and want you in their crew?
In the beginning of my career, that was definitely hard. And I think it's made me love rowing in even more. And I was just going to say in hindsight, because it made it harder for sure for me. But it also shaped me into who I am or who I've become. I was always a smaller rower. Most of the guys I competed against were much bigger, much stronger than I was, and most coaches, somewhat understandably, will always look to those bigger guys first and give them, I guess, more opportunities, just because it makes logical sense that bigger, stronger guys will make boats go faster. But I was determined to prove that notion incorrect, or not always the case. So I showed up at Cal, 6'1", 170 pounds, and definitely not a recruit. I was sort of allowed onto the team somewhat, not somewhat reluctantly, I guess. And like I said, I think it's made me love going through the process that I had to go through. Has made me love the process even more, looking back on it, because it's proven, or it's shown me that rowing is self-selecting. Those athletes, even that are given or that are born with the physical gifts of being taller and bigger and bigger lung capacity and all those sorts of things, sure, they have a slight advantage, but rowing success still comes down to who's willing or wants to work harder, and who's able to have the focus to take care of the details and be more effective at each end of the stroke. And that's why, there's still a natural ability element to rowing and rowing success. But at the end of the day, it's who's willing to work harder. And I think there's something pure and something noble and something great about that. And so, I had a lot of coaching or coaches doubt me along the way. And at first, it put a lot of roadblocks in my path, but I responded, and it wasn't an easy process, but I responded to those roadblocks by working harder. I showed up at Cal, and I was behind the rest of the group. I had been a good rower at my high school in Canada, but I think I had a pretty good work ethic, but I still showed up and had to prove a lot of people wrong. And so I just put in 3 or 4 or 5 extra workouts a week on top of what we did with the crew, all the scheduled workouts. I would put in an hour or an hour and a half more every day, and it pays off. And that's what I've told the story over and over again to the guys that I coach, is if you want something, or if you're 14 years old and you have your sights set on Olympic gold medal, there's nothing more or better you can do than turn that goal or turn that wish or inspiration into hard work. The only way to get there is to work harder than everybody else. And I really have taken that through every stage of my rowing career. Taking care of the details. Going into the 2007 year, I was 185 pounds and 6'2", 185 pounds. And that was a gap that I needed to close. Most of my competition was 6'6", 210, 215, something like that. And I needed to close that weight gap to try to be competitive. So I ate 9,000 to 10,000 calories a day. And that was a fourth workout every day to try to fit that much food into my system. But I very slowly put on weight. And in the 2008 year, I topped out at 205 pounds. And again, doing the same sort of thing. And in the 2012 year, I topped out at 215 pounds and raced at 205. So I've been a driven little guy that's had to take care of the details, and it's gotten me through or gotten me past a lot of doubting coaches, and it's also made me into who I am. So even though it made the process difficult in the beginning, looking back, I wouldn't change anything.
That's a fantastic summary of your career, Scott. Thank you. The last question. Go on.
To give some perspective, so I topped out at 215 in the 2012 year, and now training for Ironman, and sucking down to be faster on the bike and faster on the run. I'm 40 to 45 pounds lighter. I'm 170 pounds.
Fantastic. Chris George, who's listening, has also done an Ironman and qualified for Kona in his age group, and he then gave his place to someone else because he was doing it as a fundraiser for a friend who is in need of medical assistance. But he says, good luck with the Ironman. Let me know if Scott wants any free coaching with 3 exclamation marks.
Nice. Okay.
How have you actually lost the weight to step down to the Ironman requirements?
Well, I'm naturally 185 pounds, or what is that, 83, 84 kilos.
Yeah.
And to force myself up to the 96, 97 kilos that I got up to, I had to force feed myself. So I was able to, somewhat artificially get myself up to that weight, but within a few weeks I was down to 190. Maybe not a few weeks, but a few months for sure of just eating normally. And then with the Ironman training, it's just a lot of volume, and so I'm getting 3.5 hours a day of volume in. So I'm doing the same volume of training, a lot less intense than say rowing training, and I'm eating a slightly restricted regular diet. I actually have to control my portions and maybe eat a salad or two for lunch. But I'm definitely not starving myself or really dieting. I'm just eating a normal, slightly reduced maybe diet and pushing the volume. And very slowly over the course of the last year after London, I got down from 215 to 170.
Chris says he's going for Kona in 2016. See you there.
Nice, that's great.
Now, last question. Peter has asked, what did you find most valuable in Mike Spracklen's coaching programs for the Canadian team?
Okay. I've been very vocal about my my disagreement with Mike Sprocklen on a lot of things. Lack of selection process, the way he's run a camp, and a bunch of other things. But I'm still able to take a step back and see the positives that he did bring to a training camp or a training environment. And he instills a very competitive and hardworking environment. It's very hard-edged, which is good. It also has a negative impact on a lot of athletes. But for those that are in his group that he is positively pushing along, I guess, there are a lot of athletes that have a very steep learning curve, and he can get some fairly inexperienced rowers or new guys to the team up to a very competitive level quickly. And I saw the benefits of that coming onto the team in 2003, and really just for the Athens year. So yeah, I think that's the main benefit. I think over the course of a long period on the Canadian team or in one of his programs, I think it has a very wearing effect on a lot of the athletes. Not everybody, but it burns a lot of guys out. So they have this steep learning curve, and then some will crash and burn just because it's a very hard physical but also emotionally difficult training program to get through, and not just the training program. It's all the other peripheral, mental games and that sort of stuff that he sees as necessary. And again, he's had some good results, and so you can't argue with those necessarily. But he's also had a lot of negative results as well. So we'll leave it at that.
Fair enough. Question from a listener, Gary, who says there seems to be an emphasis developing today that encourages sculling into the sweep rowers training. Is this something you support?
I do, and it's always in my experience on the national team under Mike and under Terry Paul. There was a lot of sculling. We did probably half of our workouts through the week in singles, I actually spent the first a year and a half of my rowing career learning in a single, and I think it forces you to develop a boat feel that you don't necessarily get, say, in eights or Cox fours. In those bigger boats, you're able to just get in there and kind of whack away at the stroke and train hard, but you're not forced to actually learn how to move the boat. And I think the single is the best way to expose you if you're not actually focusing on how to move the boat. So we would do a lot of our training sessions competitively, side by side, rate controlled in singles, and it very quickly exposes those guys who are not moving the boat effectively. And I think a secondary benefit is that it balances out the body. You know, if you're always rowing, sweep rowing, and always rowing on one side, it can, doesn't always, but it can lead to injuries. And I think rowing sculling helps to balance out the back and the body in general.
Fantastic. On that note, Scott, thank you very much for your time. It's been a most enjoyable hour spent in your company. Your frankness and your openness, both with your experience, but also with your advice and observations, has been really enlightening. And I know that all of our listeners are going to be enjoying listening and re-listening to this rowing chat. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.